Okay, so in this video we're going to learn about Docker Compose, and in this section we're going to learn a little bit more about Docker Compose and some of the things that comes along with Docker Compose. Um, all right, the goals here: we're going to install Docker Compose, we're going to learn what Docker Compose is, and we're going to learn why it's useful. And so once we get through all that, we'll go through our challenge, which is to redeploy our phpMyAdmin or the adminer Docker container with MySQL database using Docker Compose. All right, so let's get to it. Let's install Docker Compose. So to install Docker Compose, if you're on a Linux system, which hopefully you most likely are, or you'd be on Windows Toolbox, Windows Docker Toolbox, you'll be able to just go in here and copy this link. And now note here that if you do want the most up-to-date version, you'll want to go to this link, which I have open here. So actually the most latest release is 1.17.1. So I'm going to copy and paste this link in here to get the Docker Compose. So what I've noticed about the Windows Docker Toolbox, it does say that it installs it, but I've seen in several installations for that I've done in the past on PCs, sometimes it doesn't actually correctly install it. So doing this will ensure that that you get it installed perfectly. So what this command does is essentially it downloads the binary from this URL and outputs it into your Docker Compose bin. So that makes it immediately available from your command line anywhere in when SSH'd into this Docker machine. And what it also what you need to do before you can actually use it is you're going to actually have to do a chmod, and that command is also right there in these installation instructions. And I'll make sure that all the links that you've seen in the videos are accessible in one way or another. But here you go. So we're going to chmod. So now it should be executable. So to make sure that we have a working installation, all you need to do is do a docker-compose v. A docker-compose -v. There you go. That's the correct build, and we're off to the races. Okay, so the first thing, what is Docker Compose? All right, Docker Compose at its core is essentially a templated Docker container deployment. So what it allows you to do is basically orchestrate a bunch of Docker commands in an easy to read way. As you noticed before, we have there's like tons of options, tons of things that your Docker command could end up being super long to deploy and multifaceted to deploy a complex application. So to make things a little easier to read, Docker created this basically Docker Compose software to translate a templated file, a templated YAML file in particular, and turn them into a bunch of Docker commands for you. So that, and the other benefit that this has is it allows you to easily version control your deployments. So now your Docker Compose file is just your deployment is another file to be saved, and you can make see the changes over time. So if there are anything from the deployment reason that would cause an issue, you can see the version history of all the working deployments and all the non-working deployments, etc., etc. So there's a lot of benefits to using Docker Compose YAMLs, especially over like the other alternative would be to create very complex bash scripting or something like that, where you're creating your own sort of own way of orchestrating a bunch of Docker run commands and create commands and things like that. But it's just a lot easier, and it looks a lot cleaner when you look at it here. So let's look at an example. So every Docker Compose template is going to have at least two things. You're always going to want to have your version, and I recommend getting up to date on at least the third version, possibly even the second version. 3.1 I believe is the most recent, so try and keep yourself up to date. Basically some small things change or they add new features, so based on the version those features will be accessible to you or not. So make sure you are looking at documentation that you are looking at correlating version. Okay, so the next thing is services. So services are essentially the containers that we're deploying. So if you look here, I've already pre-populated this with a Tomcat 1 and a Tomcat 2. All right, so we have two Tomcat containers that are going to be deployed here. And I've already filled out some of the common key values that you'd want. So every service, or every container here that's being deployed is going to have this your key as the name of the container. And this isn't the full name, so this is the name as it relates to stuff within this Docker Compose file. When you actually look and do a Docker PS after starting this up, it's actually going to be whatever the whatever the parent directory is that this Docker Compose file is contained in by default, appended with an underscore and then your service name or your container name here. So this would actually end up looking like, and that is wrong, so let's fix that. Here we go. This will actually end up looking like when you do, man, this is buggy today. All right. So this will end up looking like is like that, Docker comp underscore Tomcat 1, and this would be Docker comp underscore Tomcat 2. So then you'd have your ports declaration, which would be very important if you want to make this accessible outside of the Docker cluster. So you can have a list, essentially a list syntax here for your host port to your container port, very similar to the -p that you can use on the Docker run command. Another thing that you can do as well in here, just like you can do on the Docker run command, is do environment variables. So Docker run, it would be -e, and then you'd have as many -es as you want. So here, in a similar fashion, you can do it with the key value. So this would be the environment variable, and this would be the value, test 1, 2, 3, 4. So another thing Docker Compose does for us, and we'll touch a little bit more on this in the future, but it sort of links all of these containers together based on the name of the service or name of the container here. So you can make one container accessible to the other. This makes it a lot easier to do orchestrated deployments for instance, with if you had to use Redmine and Postgres database. So that way you could do all of your naming conventions, everything would be contained within this one compose file, and you would just reference one another from here. So that way it keeps all of the important information there, and you don't have to remember to run a separate command to make sure you link it with the correct alias, because it's all here. If you forget, you literally just look 3 lines below it, and there it is. So this is a very useful, Docker Compose is very, very useful for more complex deployments where you have multiple dependencies, multiple container dependencies for your application. All right, so now that we've talked a lot about sort of a generic, a very basic Docker Compose, let's fire it up. Let's see it work in action. Okay, so to run a Docker Compose template, all right, you're going to do a Docker Compose, because we just downloaded the binary, so that is obviously going to be the first part of the command. And then if you were to just do a Docker Compose up, all right, so Docker Compose up is basically going to search the local directory for a docker-compose.yaml. What you can also do is you do a -f, and if it were a special type of file, any kind of file, you've renamed it in a different way or whatever, you can use that name for the file, and so you can explicitly tell it which file to use. But we've named it docker-compose.yaml, so it'll be able to easily find it. So now when I click enter, we should see some information. Ooh, there we go. So if you recall, remember when we ran Docker run, if we didn't do a -d, it runs everything in the console. Docker Compose does the same thing. The cool thing about it, though, is it actually tells you what logs are coming from what container. So if you look here on the left, Tomcat1_1, so that means this is the Tomcat 1, the first single instance of the Tomcat 1. And here's Tomcat 2. All right, and so now you can see both logs in a unified way. All right, so actually I don't want to run this on my console. So gracefully stop. Look at those hearts. Isn't that cute? All right. Okay, so I don't want to run this interactively. Generally, you want to run things as a daemon. So here you want to put your -d after the up command, because the up is sort of the like, I want to start this up. So now you should see, all right, it's starting the Docker containers. Okay. So now if I do a Docker ps, all right, all right, now Docker ps. You can see I've got, let's see, it's a little too big. You can see over here, all right. You can see over here I've got my Docker comp _ tomcat1 _ 1, tomcat2 _ 1. All right, so it's my first instances, and you can see all the port declarations mapped correctly. Everything's looking good. So I want to show you how these two could communicate with each other if they so desired. So if there was some dependency between containers, then this would be a good way to do it. So to do that, I'm going to be able to, I'm going to need to access the command line, so of one of these containers. So I'm going to do docker exec -it, and then I'm going to use my container name, and then I'm going to run bin/bash. All right, so now I'm in. So now if I do a ping on tomcat on, let's do a ping on docker comp _. So this actually shouldn't return. Oh, it does. Okay, so we get multiple ways to communicate with containers here. So what you can also do, which is what I recommend, since in our Docker Compose we said Tomcat2 was the name, what you can do instead is use the actual true name of the container and of the service instead, because there's an alias. These two can communicate with each other based on that alias. All right, and it looks like you can communicate with any container using its name. So let's try youthful curry. Let's do a ping on that. Oh, no. So you can only communicate this. That's what I expected. Okay, so these two containers can only communicate with each other, and you have the option of either communicating with just the service name that you've declared or the entire container name. I was surprised because I've never actually done that before. But you can actually do it with the entire container name. So you get multiple aliases to communicate with one another. All right. So you can see that. Hopefully you can definitely see let's exit out of here. Always does that. Okay. So you can definitely see the usefulness of being able to have all of your important information in terms of the DNS, like the DNS host name that you can access services between multiple containers for complex deployments. Oh, and another thing that we want to look at. So let's make sure that our environment variable is accessible. So if I do a docker exec -it, let's see, docker tomcat2, and then remember we're going to do bin bash. All right, let's scroll down here. Okay, so now, oh, actually I need the environment variable as well. So now, to prove that this environment variable is able to be used, so we're going to do an echo. Ooh, I didn't copy. Let's see, I think it was test env var. All right, there you go. It is accessible. So it just goes to show that there's a lot easier ways to deploy Docker containers than doing a bunch of different Docker run commands. So I definitely recommend keeping Docker Compose in mind whenever you're doing your deployments. All right, so now that we've learned a little bit about Docker Compose, why it's important, why it can be useful, let us get to our challenge. Let me find my slide. All right, so your challenge. So remember, it's going to be to deploy your phpMyAdmin and MySQL deployment using Docker Compose instead of doing the Docker run commands and linking. So, yep, good luck. I will have the answer for you in the next video.